Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And this was one of those interesting weeks where a lot would happen. I personally, when I do the show, like to let the dust settle, like to let more facts, more information come out before I jump onto a topic and then cover it. Give it a few days, maybe a week at most. But this week was a series of those events because, of course, you had the attempt on Trump's life, which we'll get into domestic U.S. news later. A lot of the news surrounding Biden, the nonsense of the RNC, both the good and the bad, which I'll at least just cover Trump's speech and JD Vance's speech, who, since I recorded last episode, yes, he is Donald Trump's running mate, the senator from Ohio, which I'll get more into that later. And of course, there's plenty of news out of Ukraine, both on the front line, the politics surrounding Ukraine, and Europe in general. But without further ado, let's just get right into it because there's quite a bit to cover, starting with a brief front update in Ukraine. So we see Russian advances in the south, near Kherson, near Yevgenovka, Novosilovka, Persha, and Vozdizhenka. And moving further north from that, you have New York or Novgorodskoye with further Russian advances as well as Russian advances on Zalizhne, which is east of Toretsk. And the Battle of Chasiv Yar does continue. The Ukrainians do still put up fierce resistance, but in the end, it's just too much for them to really hold off the Russians indefinitely. So you do have the Russians chipping away on that front as well as they do move into Kalinovka, which is northeast of Chasiv Yar. Moving on to the actions of the Zapadi battle group, we have in the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic, Russian advances and engagements with Ukrainian forces in Krasny Liman, in Severbryanka, in Korsharovka, and Boguslavka, the latter two being actually in the Kharkov Oblast. You have Russian troops moving along, also once again in the DPR, taking the settlement of Vokshad according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Recent news as of just a few minutes ago as recording this, Yorozhaine has fallen to the Russians. With after heavy artillery bombardment, you had the infantry come in and really. I don't think you can really use the phrase short work for anything in this war, but the closest you can get in this war for short work. Now, on the Ukrainian side, the AFU has moved significant reserves to the northern Kharkov Oblast from the rear and other fronts because they do fear that the Russians are going to make an offensive on the city of Kharkov in the coming weeks and or months, depending on how long the offensive take. But there has been a lot of activity in Kharkov, especially with Volchansk, which I'll get into in just a moment here. And the AFU also shelled Gorlovka with 9 155mm shells, as well as explosives dropped from a drone. Donetsk City with 21 155mm shells, as well as a drone attack accompanying that, and a drone attack on the Donetsk-Mariupol highway as well. And you do see, even after Avdiivka fell, which was one of the main heights that they would use to shell Donetsk City, it still is a problem. It still is happening, and that these attacks do continue like they have been going on for 9 years. So Avdiivka was not the end of it by any means. Now, certainly it relieved a lot of the pressure on Donetsk City, but they are far from out of the woods in this case. Now, returning to Kharkov Oblast, we have the Sever Battle Group engaging Ukrainian forces in Volchansk, and they've also inflicted damage on AFU positions with further movement on Lipsky, which is west of Kharkov as well. But the trend of a gradual Russian advance along the front does continue as Ukrainian forces falter, as there's issue with aid. There's a hell of a story about the F-16s, which I'll get into in just a few minutes here. But the support for the Ukrainian war effort is not what it once was. And I don't think I need to really go too deep into that because I've said it many times before. A lot of people have said it before. The idea of a souring on the idea of continuing the Ukraine war is picking up. I mean, you can just look at what happened domestically in the U.S. with a lot of Trump statements just over the past week, a lot of the RNC statements over the past week when it came to the issues of foreign policy. There tends to be a pivot towards issues of the Middle East, particularly pertaining to Iran. And also, the current administration is beleaguered in its own right. You don't hear anything too much about Ukraine from that. But getting on to some of the political news surrounding Ukraine, you did have NATO leaders agree to allocate 40 billion euros of military aid to Ukraine in 2025, also joined by a Canadian pledge of a military assistance package to Ukraine in the amount of $500 million Canadian, which is about $367 USD, and that came straight from Trudeau, as well as the UK joining in on the pledges, saying it will make support for Ukraine one of their top priorities, with Keir Starmer and the new Labour government coming out and pledging that. Starmer, of course, is also meeting with Zelensky as well as we speak, so we'll see if anything significant comes out of that. Doubtful, but we'll see. And Macron's plans to send instructors to Ukraine has actually broken down as a result of the fall of the elections because of the situation they have with Parliament, with a hung Parliament. Even though it does look like there are going to be some breakthroughs with that, I'm holding off on reporting anything about the French elections until I get more confirmation about what the new composition of government is actually going to look like. And the U.S. aid package to Ukraine, worth $225 million, does include a Patriot missile battery, NASAM air defense systems, shells, and other ammunitions, according to statements released by Blinken earlier this week. And probably the biggest story out of Ukraine, at least as far as I am concerned, is what seems to be a collapse in morale that has been predicted by a lot of people for a long time, and has been a question I have tried to keep at the forefront of this program. That whenever we talk about Ukraine, I ask, what is the breaking point? At what point does the Ukrainian population, both under arms and civilian population still living in the country, look at this and realize the situation is simply unassailable, the situation is too much to bear, and that there really has to be something done about that? And with that, there's some new data that was released that, according to recent polls, 43.9% of Ukrainians believe that it is time for some sort of peace negotiation with Russia. Now, what that actually looks like in reality, whether it's what the West has been talking about, where it's Russia will give up everything and then we'll negotiate. But point being is, 43.9% of Ukrainians admitted in the survey. Mind you, there's a lot of the people who wouldn't dare admit such things in any sort of public sense. Almost half of Ukrainians admitted that, yes, there is some sort of role for negotiation. Continued on with 35% firmly disagreeing, saying that the war must continue, that there cannot be any compromises with Moscow on that. And then an additional 21.1% found the question difficult to answer, as they had put it. Continuing on with issues within the Ukrainian armed forces, according to individual troops, the videos they've posted on Telegram, social media, etc., they do raise the issue of pay being actually distributed to the troops, that there has been holds on pay, there has been a hold on how much money they are getting. And for those of you who just know the first thing about history, when pay fails to go to the soldiers, when the army feels snubbed, especially the infantrymen in that regard, that's when you get regime change. That's when you get coups. That is when you get monumental shifts in power in some cases. So we could see some disorder within Ukraine if we are to believe these reports beyond just a few soldiers. And of course, these are anonymous soldiers. These are men wearing masks, talking to the camera. I'm sure you've all seen the sort of video on mainly Telegram is where you see where these get posted, saying that our pay is being stymied, we're not getting it, our needs are not being met on the front lines. And this also brings up the point of defections and draft dodging. So I'll start with another statistic here in that regard. 1 in 10 military-aged Ukrainian men are abroad, with the top destinations being Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, and Canada. And I will return to one of the graphics I have from February. Once again, this is from the Twitter account from Kherson, and these figures are quoted from Ukrainska Pravda, which is one of the bigger media outlets in Ukraine. And just to clarify, as of February of this year, according to the data that Ukrainska Pravda collected, to reiterate, 26% of military-age men are in Russian-held territory. 25% are employed in some field deemed too important to drag away from them to conscript, whether that be in some sort of logistics, some sort of wartime industry, etc., etc. 13% are invalids, for whatever reason unfit for military service, which brings up the question, how many of these men are genuinely unfit for military service? How many of them had connections or bribes in order to get the medical exemption or whatever exemption it might be in order to avoid service? 11% are actually actively in the armed forces to some degree, whether that actually be on the front line or within some non-combat position, whatever. 11% are abroad, which, like I said, going back to the 110 figure, about 10-11% are abroad, mostly being in Poland, Germany, the Czech Republic, or Canada. Mind you, there's also something of upwards of, I believe, 2 million Ukrainian refugees in Russia since the outbreak of the Russian intervention in Ukraine, the direct Russian intervention on the 24th of February 2022, not counting the number of Eastern Ukrainians who had gone to Russia since the Maidan. And then the last section that, to quote this once again, is business owners who, at least seemingly according to Ukrainian law, I don't know the exact details, but according to this data, would be exempt from any sort of conscription, which, to quote Ukrainska Pravda, to quote from Kherson once again, good Twitter account, I recommend you check it out. If it's still up, I can't remember. They might have gotten suspended. It escapes me right now, but if they are still up, I would certainly recommend it. Which leaves about 950,000, at least according to the numbers in February, or 9% of military-age men in Ukraine who can be drafted. And of course, there is further talk. I know that they did lower the conscription age to 25. There's further talk of knocking it down lower, whether that be 21, whether that be even 18 is what some of the more hardliners demand. But those numbers don't mesh with the statistics that we just quoted when it came to the number of draft dodgers, effectively, which, look, I'll put it this way. Despite the connotations of that term, I don't fault them in any degree for not wanting to fight in this war. Or just the various other ways they get out of service and the conditions on the front lines. So, what is being said by some of the biggest promoters of the war versus the people actually within the country Ukraine, to probably very few people's surprise, is very night and day sentiments. And there were some statements put out by members of the 79th Brigade Cyborgs of the AFU, addressed directly to Syrskyi, commander of the Ukrainian forces. And I quote, "Where's the order to withdraw from Krasnogorovka? The quote-unquote boss does not wish to save the lives of soldiers who are ready to die for Ukraine. Instead, he wishes to waste them. The only good news is that the 79th has escape routes to leave, a pity, as other units do not. The Russians have intensified actions. We have no supplies, as all the supply routes are broken. The Russians are trying to encircle us. Why are we not leaving? Soon, the only way out will be effing swimming through the lakes." And then that's just one man in one brigade on the front lines. Once again, near Krasnogorovka, to clarify. And I'm sure his sentiment is not alone. It's just that he is the one who is willing to speak up about that. He is the one who's willing to go out there and maybe not entirely put his face, but actually go out there and make that statement, address his commander, ask what is the sense of this mission, which once again shows a bit of a failure on that part. And say what you will about Zaluzhny, but you did get the impression, love him or hate him, that he actually had concerns for the life of the men under his command, under his authority. Because look, there was a lot of disastrous things about the 2023 counteroffensive, which you can attribute to Sierski, you can attribute to Zelensky, maybe even Zelensky himself. But the more conservative voice, the more level-headed voice in all of that was always Zelensky. Love him or hate him, that's what it was. And he recommended several times that the current state of the war, the way the AFU is conducting this war effort, is simply not sustainable. It's too costly in both equipment and lives, and we need to radically restructure how we're fighting this war if we're to have any hope of pulling off anything that even constitutes a victory, that even constitutes a stalemate at that point. Looking at the way the Ukrainian war effort's being fought, even that becomes more difficult day by day. And the longer the Ukrainians put off negotiations, I know there's been some hints, there's been some speculation about that, the worse the peace deal is going to be. And it's really just that simple. What could have been, now, you can talk about the Istanbul Accords all you want. Would they have held whatever? No, probably not. But it would have bought them much needed time for armament, for preparation. Now, I know they had 8 years for that. Since the Maidan, NATO had 8 years to turn this country into a fortress. Once again, we're talking about the largest country in Europe, excluding Russia. Massive amounts of land. Fertile land at that. And we'll get into some of the questions about Ukrainian land in just a moment here. Decent population despite some of the emigration issues, at least pre-Maidan. And plenty of military equipment from the Soviet days, not to mention time to pump in military equipment, time to send over Western trainers, which they did all that to a certain degree. And once again, don't take me as somebody who supports this or wanted a further militarization of Ukraine or an escalation there, but I'm just saying, theoretically, from the NATO perspective, if we're to believe everything that the talking heads in Brussels or Washington, D.C. or London or Paris or whoever told us, their actions do not reflect their, at least what they've said, what their sentiments are. Which I think there's a number of reasons for that we could get into, but I don't want to get too far off topic here. But this is the state of the Ukrainian armed forces, especially under Sierski, the butcher, who has no regard for his men, no regard for this nation at all. I mean, there's questions of how much loyalty does he actually hold to Ukraine, having been from an ethnic Russian family from Moscow, estranged from most of his family right now. I know he's not on speaking terms with his brother. His own stepson in the diaspora in Australia has Russian citizenship. Went to the embassy, requested it. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think he also openly stated at the embassy he was voting for Putin. So, this is the man who's in charge of the Ukrainian armed forces. And certainly, think what you will about the Ukrainian national project, but this doesn't speak of somebody who's loyal to it, but much more opportunistic, saw a path forward within Ukrainian politics, within the Ukrainian military, that didn't exist in Russia, and snaked on Russia for that, and when it comes down to the wire, at least addressing some of the accusations of some members of the Rada, I believe, I can't remember her name, but the one woman in the Rada who was part of Zelensky's party who was throwing accusations that Sierski has plans to betray this country when it comes to a peace agreement and secure a better position for himself. Given what we know about this man, all of that's true. This is a man of no loyalty. And, look, I think if the Russians have any sense of self-preservation, they won't accept any overtures from this man, given his track record. I think the best he can hope for is getting some think tank in Washington, D.C. or some other Western city, or working as a quote-unquote advisor to some Western military, have the butcher himself advise them on military tactics having fought a modern war. Not very well, but once again he has those credentials when this all falls through. Assuming he doesn't get liquidated by one side or the other, he's got a golden parachute. Same with Zelensky. They both have golden parachutes. Most of the Ukrainian elite have golden parachutes. The ones who can escape getting liquidated by either their own sponsors or the Russians, in which, frankly, their own sponsors are more likely to do so. Because that's the state we're at with this war. But, like I said, this is only one of many stories that have come out from the front lines and will likely follow. And with Ukraine's drive to recruit more men, it is possible, it is being debated, about the seizure of property from draft dodgers if they do not pay the fines issued by them to military military registration officers, because one of the penalties, of course, they do face is fines for that, and if they don't pay the fines, of course, don't pay the extortion money that will go further towards the war effort, which will eventually try to conscript them, they're going to seize their property instead. And in 2023, new figures have come out. 1,600 AFU troops have been convicted of desertion, which has become the most common conviction of soldiers in this war. Granted, I don't know what else the Ukrainians would really convict their soldiers on in this case, except I don't know, maybe some sort of failure to follow orders. But with this, 1,600, and those are the only ones who have been convicted. Think about all the ones who have probably gotten away at this point. And I know there's been talk of, since the start of the war, up to 400,000 draft dodgers, 400,000 people who have managed to evade conscription one way or another. Which, you know what? I'll say once again, more power to them. One thing I think Western countries should do, and I understand the position of maybe a country like Poland, which has had a number of problems taking in a large amount of Ukrainian refugees, but frankly, somebody sitting in my position, where I stand, and my views on this, we should have open doors to all Ukrainian refugees, regardless of age. Pretty much, in my opinion, if we can prove these people are not extreme Ukrainian nationalist banderites, for lack of a better term, people who are fully dedicated to this project, they should be more than welcome. What better way to stop this war than to give refuge to the unwilling participants in it? And out of all the people who actually need a place to flee from, beyond the economic woes of, say, whatever African or Middle Eastern nation that a lot of migrants come from, the Ukrainians certainly have a case for it. There's more of a case for Ukrainian men than anyone from Afghanistan to be in the Western countries. Afghanistan, I mean, its regime might not be the friendliest. It may not be the most amenable to whatever else. I don't know, maybe depending on ethnicity, the concern about women's rights, whatever. Point being is, Afghanistan isn't under constant shelling. Afghanistan is not an active war zone. There's some insurgency, there's some violence, but it's overall a stable society. It's far more of a case for Ukrainians to be in the West than Afghans, by far. Way by far with that. And especially these Ukrainian men who are being thrown in vans and shipped off to the front lines with little to no training, probably in some of these cases. And just from 2023 alone, looking at the southern front, in Krinky alone, there's been reported 788 defections or desertions from the front in Krinky, which has been one of those fronts that is just pointless to hold. The Russians do have a foothold, and they're only going to advance, but Ukrainian command keeps putting forces there as a stopgap, which, once again, we're talking Krinky and Kherson, and it's just one of those fronts they just want to keep on throwing bodies at, that they don't have the wisdom or the concern to retreat from. And this is how they'll continue to treat their men. And I do think with some of the protests that are taking place, because you have in places like Odessa, places like, it was near Kryvyi Rog, I believe it was, where the dam burst. Because of the strikes on infrastructure, because of Russian strikes on infrastructure, over the past year or so, is really around late 2022, we saw the increase in strikes on infrastructure from the Russians. That, and also combined with heat waves, also combined with high temperatures, has put a strain on the Ukrainian power grid, which has led to blackouts, which has led to lack of power. And naturally, especially with more vulnerable populations, you might think the elderly, which Ukraine is an aged nation. You look at the demographics, especially in light of the amount of casualties taken in the war and where the demographics of those people come from. Once again, I know at this point the average age of the Ukrainian soldier is about 42, 43, but we're talking young or middle-aged men, just to paint broad brushstrokes, has really bumped up the average age of Ukraine quite a bit, unfortunately, with how many casualties have been taken with this. A lot of the vulnerable populations are suffering and dying as secondary effects of this war because the power grids are being hit. And while I understand it's wartime, it's not like there's much the government in Kiev can really do, but even what few methods they would have to provide relief to these people, they're clearly not following through with them because they have bigger and better concerns, according at least to the people in Kiev. And protests in Odessa have gotten to the point where people are blocking roads, they're taking to the streets, and I mean, this is a combination of factors when it comes to the conscription drives, when it comes to the lack of power, when it comes to just general decline in the standard of living. Because you do look at this, you do look at what's been happening in Ukraine. I know you see the TikToks, you see the women in Lavrov or wherever it might be, or in Kiev, these areas that are relatively untouched by the war, who are trying to emulate the lifestyle of Western urbanites. And look, that does happen, and it is a major disparity. And look, if I were Ukrainian, I would be resentful as hell towards those people. Uh, Maybe even more so than the Russians at that point. But that is not reality for everyday Ukrainians. Men, women, and children alike. Don't make no mistake. That is a very small subset of, like I said, people in Kiev and Lvov who are living those lifestyles. Whereas Odessa, it's suffered immensely because of this war. Anywhere in the east suffered immensely because of this war. And I know that, relatively speaking, I don't want to downplay the cost of human life here, but relatively speaking, this has been a rather low civilian casualty war because the civilians have had ample time to evacuate, and that the battles are mostly taking place in these small, mostly abandoned villages and out in what are more or less rural areas, and that in terms of urban warfare, aside from some isolated cases, think Mariupol, think Bakhmut, even Avdiivka to a degree, urban warfare has been much more sparse than one would have expected this war. This war has been kept, like I said, mostly to the fields, mostly to the villages, because it's honestly much easier for both sides to conduct offenses, build defenses on that kind of terrain, in that kind of location, and really avoiding the slog of urban warfare, like I said, that we saw. I think Bakhmut is the primary example, but Mariupol is probably the other example that one could point to there. And the civilians that are left in Ukraine, like I said, although civilian casualties are fortunately very low, especially compared to some of the other war zones in the world, one might think Gaza, it is still a strain on the lives of everyday Ukrainians, and the ones who can get out are getting out because even after this war ends, there's not going to be anything left for them. There's devastation. How much money do you think is going to be invested in the reconstruction of Ukraine? And that's not even taking into consideration the territorial concessions that they will more than likely have to make to Russia. What will the investment in Ukraine be? It'll be nothing. They'll grab up the land, they'll grab up the fertile soil, they'll use that. It'll be given to the IMF, to BlackRock, to, once again, any of these usual suspects. Any of these organizations is very easy to point the finger at, which I'm not saying they don't deserve it. They more than certainly do. But in terms of actual investment in Ukraine, in terms of actually getting these people home when it comes to these Ukrainians abroad, it's not going to happen. If anything, you're going to see more of resettlement in the Russian-held areas, like you saw in parts of eastern Ukraine, like you saw in the Zaporozhye Oblast, like you saw in Donetsk and Luhansk. You're going to see far more resettlement in those sort of areas of the people who actually lived there before the war than you will anywhere in central or western Ukraine. That's just off the table. And like I said, for these Ukrainians who are moving to Western countries, moving to Poland, wherever, they're establishing themselves. They are making lives for themselves. And like I said, that's all across the demographic spectrum, because there's plenty of young men who have managed to escape from Ukraine. And what reason would they have to go back? I suppose you could talk about loyalty to one's homeland. And while I'll reiterate once again, I don't fault anyone for avoiding service in this catastrophic war. And you would think that one who was really dedicated to the homeland would rather give up their life fighting for it than flee the country. And I think the ones who are willing to do that are either already in active service or have already fallen in combat. But when it comes to, like I said, the Ukrainians abroad, how many of them are actually going to return home? No, this is land that's going to be leased out. It's going to be turned into massive either corporate owned or IMF owned farmland, and that's going to be the fate of what's left of Ukraine. This nation is going to be devastated, depopulated, which does lend itself to some conspiracy theories that I won't get into at this time. But beyond that, there's going to be no real investment in reconstruction. You can talk about, look, the reconstruction efforts in Russian-held areas in Ukraine, I admit, are probably corrupt as hell. There's probably a lot of graft going on there. There's probably a lot of underhanded dealings going on there. But at least so far, and we'll see 5-10 years down the road, there has been some progress in the actual reconstruction of these parts of Ukraine. Like I said, will it last? Will it be quality reconstruction? Those questions remain to be answered. Very well, this could all fall through. I fully open to that possibility. But in the other parts of Ukraine, in the quote-unquote free Ukraine, and the independent Ukraine, quote-unquote, what reconstruction efforts are we going to see there? Nothing. And you look at Ukrainian finances, nothing. And trust me, I'll get into Ukrainian finances, the question of default, with that in just a moment here. But moving on to some of the other news surrounding Ukraine, there was a very odd incident when it came to the transfer of the F-16s, which, mind you, the F-16s have been promised to Ukraine for 18 months now. And now they're saying they're going to be up in the air in 2025, or Ukraine is going to have an air force once again in 2025. The Russians have already put bounties on the F-16s for any of their pilots who can manage to down one, which F-16's fine aircraft, don't get me wrong. But what's the quality of the pilot here? What's the quality of the operators here? Are they even going to be Ukrainians at that point? Or are they going to be Western quote-unquote volunteers flying these things? Those questions remain to be answered. If they even manage to get those up, if the F-16s aren't one of those empty promises that keep giving, that are constantly given to the Ukrainians, which I wouldn't doubt at that rate. I have no reason to believe that, especially with the direction the Ukraine war is going, that they're going to rush getting an air force to them. But the mysterious part is, a U.S. military officer by the name of Richard Kierlin has turned up mysteriously dead during a 10-day trip to Kiev to actually arrange for F-16 transfers to Ukraine. And, of course, speculations are flying. Did the Russians do this? Was it the Ukrainians? What exactly killed this man? Because nobody really knows. And it's just one of those things that, on top of the, once again, amount of graft and corruption that go on the Western side, on the Ukrainian side, when it comes to military aid, because a lot of it has embezzled, a lot of it has not made it to the front lines. There's been U.S. weapons that have ended up on black markets across the world that were supposed to be going to Ukraine. We've seen this since 2022. And all of a sudden you have this man turn up dead. Who knows? Maybe he was part of some sort of smuggling ring. Now, I doubt F-16, something like that, would end up on the black market, but I can't imagine he was only overseeing the transfer of F-16s. When it comes to that, he was probably overseeing the transfers of an arms and aid package in general. And, who knows what this man was involved in. Maybe it'll come out that he was caught spying for the Russians in that story, so the Ukrainians had no choice but to liquidate him. Maybe the Russians liquidated an American military officer, which is all the more excuse for increased U.S. aid. Like I said, there's a lot of suspicious things about the story. I don't want to speculate on too much, but I wanted to bring it up because a lot of people have missed that one. A lot of people don't know that it has happened. Continuing further on with that, there has been accusations by the AFU that pro-Russian partisans posing as humanitarian volunteers have been poisoning food supplies to the Ukrainian troops in Kharkov and Donetsk. Which, that remains to be seen. Perhaps it's just another excuse to crack down on any sort of dissident population, any sort of population that isn't full-throated behind the war effort. Even if they aren't pro-Russia, even if they just want this slaughter to end because they don't want their home to be destroyed any further than it already has. Like I said, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, neutral people in Ukraine, or people who can go either way, whose primary concern in this conflict is to stop the killing, stop the violence, which, look, if I lived somewhere like that, in Kharkov, in Donetsk, in these areas that are impacted by the war, at that point, I don't think I could give less of a damn about nationality or politics. I would just want the killing to stop, which I think is the sentiment a lot of these Ukrainians are getting to. Not even quote-unquote pro-Russian Ukrainians, just everyday people who are tired of the slaughter and bloodshed on their home, on their land. And that is what gets constantly overlooked when people talk about this war. And I try my utmost to bring this up because the narrative around it, of course, with Western media especially, is Ukrainians fighting to defend their homeland, Ukrainians laying down their lives for their homeland. Well, at a certain point, you have to ask the question, the viability of that, and the future of this nation, the future of human lives at a certain point. Like I said, I'm not trying to sound like some bleeding heart here, but it becomes senseless at a certain point. And arguably it was senseless from the beginning. But this is the accusations that have been throwing around. I don't have a problem believing it in the abstract. I could see this as some sort of guerrilla tactic from pro-Russian forces, from, I don't know, maybe Russian infiltrators themselves. But this more or less seems like just another excuse for the Ukrainians to crack the whip, tell the people to get in line, get behind the war effort, or you're a Russian collaborator, like the people who accepted humanitarian aid from the Russians in the occupied territories. You were a school teacher who continued your job, you were a civil servant who continued your job and received Russian pay. Clearly, you are an agent of the Russian Federation, in which case you must be dealt with, you must be doxxed on Telegram, you must be given over to the harshest of Ukrainian forces, the harshest of Ukrainian volunteers, for the high crime of wanting to continue on with a normal life, regardless of the political and military situation that has befallen you. And, look, you can say, surely when the Russians win, they'll liquidate their own forces. I'm sure that's true. But point being is, at some point, this disaster has to stop. And I think I've made that clear. I think I've made my position since the beginning of this war very clear. But I do have to reiterate again that this is something that is spiraling out of control, and I do fully want to see this stop. And that brings us, I suppose, to the question of a peace summit, and Zelensky's attempts to organize a peace summit in Switzerland, inviting the Russians to the second Swiss peace summit. I believe it was Dmitry Peskov, who is more or less the equivalent of what the press secretary would be in the U.S. That's what he is. That's the position he holds in Russia. Jokingly asked, "What first peace summit?" The one that, of course, Russia was not invited to in Switzerland. But Switzerland, having been a country that participated in the sanctions, is viewed as too biased of a party to host the negotiations according to the Russians. And there was, one of the last things I'll cover on Ukraine when it comes to the diplomatic side, a report from the Army Times, which is an American, of course, military analytical magazine. And I just wanted to just read directly from this. So, in the U.S. intelligence community, representatives of the Western elite, Russian Federation, and Turkey are behind the scenes, quote-unquote, conducting cynical discussions about the possible partition of Ukraine, the consequences of such partition, the interests of major corporations, China, as well as Ukraine's access to the sea. Allegedly, Orban also discussed such similar things in the quote-unquote transfer of opinions mode during his peacekeeping tour. Analysts note that the interests of the EU are not taken into account by the quote-unquote big guys. It was only discussed that Kiev's control over the nuclear power plant could save Europe from electrical dependence on Russia. Referring to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is the largest power plant in Europe, the one that has been falling under shelling on and off since the war. But to continue, however, China wants to get more profit from the previously purchased 10% of the lands of Ukraine and its resources. Similarly, mega corporations also want to preserve or somehow compensate for the investments of the land in Ukraine. At the same time, Russia will, quote-unquote, definitely not give up Crimea and the lands that became part of it, but it still wants to take away all the Black Sea region in order to exclude attacks from the south. Britain is categorically against depriving Ukraine of access to the sea in Odessa, and the return of Nikolaev, Sumy, etc. Also, the newsletter notes that the scouts relate to the future of Ukraine with cold pessimism and rationalism. The country will become a stub where the remaining small population will serve as agricultural, military, and transport and energy sectors, under one way or another under the protection of the West. It is noted that Ukrainians will have to get used to the loss of territory, not only in favor of Russia, but in favor of a number of NATO members. We are probably talking about Poland, Romania, Hungary, which is an interesting idea that they would actually cede some western ground in Ukraine to these nations, actually indulge the irredentist ambitions of, let's just say, some elements of Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Of course, there's the long-standing Polish claim on somewhere like Lvov, and of course Volyn, which was the site of the infamous massacre in 1943 of the Polish population and Jewish population as well by Ukrainian nationalists in 43, and as well as the Hungarian claims on parts of Transcarpathia or Zakarpattia with significant amount of Hungarian populations, and the Romanian claims on Bukovina. And that is one way of getting parts of Western Ukraine into NATO if they want to pursue that path, but it does open up a bit of a can of worms. I don't think that we'll see any territorial concessions of Ukraine to the west. Maybe de facto, maybe you'll have quote unquote peacekeeping deployments of these various nations into these contested territories. But like I said, even that's a little bit of a stretch for me. But certainly the ceding of ground to Russia is more than likely at this point. There's going to be any sort of negotiations with this. So to continue on, U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump, if he wins the election, intends to hold talks with Russia in order to quickly resolve the topic of the Ukrainian conflict and deal with China. Senator and potential, well, he's been confirmed at this point, Vice presidential nominee JD Vance confirmed to Fox News. Before that, Vance had repeatedly spoken of what was happening in Ukraine, criticized the multi-billion-dollar aid to the country, and has pointed out that reaching the 1991 borders was unrealistic. He proposed to consolidate Ukraine's neutrality and freeze the territorial disputes. At the same time, Trump's key advisors presented a peace plan, a ceasefire based on quote-unquote prevailing front lines, cutting off aid to Kiev in case of refusal of negotiations, as well as a threat to give Ukraine a lot of weapons in case Moscow refuses. According to the American media, Trump and his peace plan will not promise to expand NATO to the east, and Russia will receive part of current Ukrainian territory. He will need to show himself as a great peacemaker for the American and world audience. However, Trump will act under pressure and control of influence group, among which will be played by the military-industrial complex and mega corporations such as Cargill, Monsanto, DuPont, etc., which have previously bought up 60% of agricultural lands in Ukraine. So, once again, that's an interesting summary of the piece from the Army Times, which is not affiliated with the U.S. military itself, just an analytical magazine, discussing these backdoor negotiations between the U.S. and Russia via Turkey. It seems like Turkey is the only nation really poised to be the peace broker in this conflict, so it probably is going to be resolved either in Istanbul, or some people may prefer a different name for the city. I think there's a couple I could think of, or Ankara for that matter, or wherever else. Probably the party best poised to host any sort of peace negotiations out. Maybe Saudi Arabia, perhaps. Finland was once a site for U.S.-Russian negotiations before its ascension into NATO. Now, I suppose Turkey also is a NATO state, but they're also a very special case in that regard. And with that, you do have to wonder, with Ukraine's default coming up, with them having to pay out their investors some way or another, whether that be the private or the state investors in Ukraine, the deadline is approaching on that. It's going to be in August. It's going to be next month that Ukraine is supposed to cough up the money it owes. It's supposed to pay out the dividends the investors were promised. And people are wondering if this is going to be the excuse to cut Ukraine loose, that it's financially insolvent, that it's no longer worth the trouble of funding the war effort. But frankly, in light of some of the speculations of that piece from the Army Times and other discussions about potential conclusions to the Ukraine war in terms of a negotiated settlement, I do have to wonder, with Donald Trump, with what is likely his return to the White House, given how beleaguered Biden is, given really the lack of an alternative to Biden, and given some of the establishment elements' overtures to make peace with Trump, especially in light of the attempt on his life, which I'll touch on later in the show with that when it comes to more domestic news. you do have to wonder if they are setting this up where the Ukrainian Project Ukraine, as they might call it over the Duran, collapses in on itself, and then Trump has to bear the responsibility for that. Trump has to be the one who failed Ukraine. Say they even put off the collapse for 6 months until February 2025. Or maybe they'll even push it a few months into spring of 2025 so there's more plausible deniability saying, well, Trump has been in office for however long and Ukraine fell in on itself, so clearly that can't be the case. It can't be Biden's fault. It can't be anyone else's fault. Trump is the one who failed Ukraine. And I do think that that's a very real possibility because they do, yes, I do believe that there are a significant number of people within the American elite, within the Western elite, who want to cut their losses in Ukraine, focus either on the Middle East or China, maybe both. And they need an out. They need something that doesn't look that embarrassing. So what better to bring back their favorite punching bag, their favorite boogeyman, and have him bear the responsibility, especially the so-called Russian puppet Donald Trump, bear the responsibility for losing Ukraine to Putin, for losing Ukraine to the evil Russians. And I do think in many ways that is why he is able to get away with the number of peace overtures he's been discussing. I mean, you've had at this point several heads of state contact Donald Trump, and not only to offer sympathy and support in light of recent events, but to discuss actual policy issues. Orban has met with him. He had phone calls with Erdogan. It was. There were a few others I'm trying to remember. I think there were somebody from the UK government who had reached out to him as well, even before all of this. Mind you, the initial legal troubles of Donald Trump started because his national security advisor, Mike Flynn, at the time, his incoming national security advisor, had a phone call with the Turks regarding relations with Russia. That's what started the whole Russiagate thing. Well, not started, but that's what intensified the whole Russiagate thing. That's what got Flynn kicked out of office. That's what brought up the impeachment charges. Was one of the ones they tried to bring it up. But it was a major scandal at the time. He allegedly violated all these acts and these espionage acts and sedition act, whatever. All these things they tried to bring him up on. And that was when he was president-elect. He was incoming into office in about a month. Had his incoming national security advisor arranged for his diplomatic dealings, what he would assume once he took office. And now Trump isn't even confirmed to be our next president. He's heavily favored to be our next president. And he's already able to conduct quasi-negotiations with several people with no issue at all. And like I said, I'm not even trying to, I guess you could say, blackpill on Trump. I'm not even trying to cast aspersions. I'm just trying to ask questions. I'm just trying to paint a fuller picture and bring things to people's minds, some things they want to consider. Because I'll admit, when it comes to a lot of stuff about Trump, which I don't want to get into right now, I don't want to dwell on this too much longer, I am iffy on whether he is back with full force, whether he is a watered-down version of what he is. And I know I haven't been necessarily too optimistic about him in the past few months, but like I said, I go back and forth myself, and I just want to paint a full picture on this and explore all the possibilities that come to, all the reasonable possibilities that come to mind with something like this. And I think there's a lot of them when it comes to questions, especially about Trump's foreign policy and what we can look at that and what the world will look like under a changing the guard with Biden and his team leaving. But to continue on with related news, we had Lavrov's address to the United Nations. So in summary, what Lavrov had brought before the UN Security Council was that Russia and the US have had unpublicized second-track contacts involving political analysis discussing issues related to the conflict in Ukraine. A resolution of the crisis in Ukraine must take into account the realities on the ground, but the West needs to stop supplying Kiev with weapons in order for the conflict to end. The West has taken a stance to push through Zelensky's quote-unquote peace plan, which amounts to an ultimatum on Russia. No one intends to provide Russia with a list of those killed in the massacre in Bucha, which took place towards the beginning of the war upon the Russian withdrawal from Kiev. very controversial to talk about for a while on YouTube, but I think we're in the clear now when it comes to discussing a controversy about that. Russia's ready for negotiations on Ukraine and European security issues. If the West comes to its senses and gets over its superiority complex, Lavrov's words, a dialogue must be possible, but Moscow will not chase after anyone, as it's not in its tradition. Moscow does not interfere in the affairs of other states, including the U.S. Obligatory, I'm sure they do, much as we do, but you don't admit to that. Moscow has irrefutable evidence of Gershakovic's involvement in espionage activities, and Russia will seek the truth regarding the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. So those are Lavrov's brief points. Still conciliatory as expected from the man who's representing Putin, but also more firm than what we have come to expect, I would say, within the past 5 to 10 years. Even despite all the escalation tensions, always a very conciliatory rhetoric coming from Moscow, coming from Lavrov, coming from Putin. And that does continue to a degree, but it's also much firmer than it used to be. So just briefly putting his comments out there on that. And then to continue on with some news related to Europe, which will mostly be focused on Orban's current dispute with the EU, especially in light of his peacemaking efforts. So, first, which is unrelated to that, is Trump is threatening the Europeans with cutting off intelligence sharing if they don't, quote unquote, pull their weight when it comes to supporting Ukraine and playing its role in NATO. And I'm sure that's just the typical back and forth Trump and Europe have had for years now. As we saw in his first term, it was a lot of back and forth, a lot of bluster, mostly from Trump, but certainly on the side of the Europeans, it certainly wasn't a one-sided thing. But Orban, having continued his peace mission, did meet with Trump in Florida after the NATO summit, and that would have been just a day before the attempt on Trump's life, so that very close timing. And Orban had tried to arrange for a meeting of foreign ministers of the European Union in order to discuss a resolution to the Ukrainian conflict in order to get a consensus of European opinion on the Ukrainian conflict, trying to broker some sort of agreement. But the EU Commission has scheduled a mandatory meeting of European foreign ministers over Orban's date, trying to subvert his mission, of course. And it also comes out, on top of all of this, a day before Orban left for Moscow, there was allegedly an assassination attempt involving a car bomb. Hungarian intelligence reports that it intercepted a call of two people who were speaking Ukrainian discussing the possibility of car bombing Orban. And on top of all of this, on top of the issue with Trump, on top of this information that has come out about Orban, you also have Budanov, head of Ukrainian intelligence, who is openly admitting that he wants to take out Putin. Which, I mean, that's to be expected of somebody like Budanov. He always does have these lofty goals. He always is one of the more aggressive figures in Ukraine. But that is in the timing of certainly an attempt on Trump, and a potential attempt on Orban if we're to believe these intelligence leaks. If we're to believe well, I suppose they're not leaks, but if we're to believe the leaked audio that Hungarian intelligence has provided. And I see no reason not to believe it, given what we know about Ukrainian intelligence. And lest we forget Robert Fico, the one who really kicked off this trend, I suppose, with his assassination attempt on the 15th of May, 2024. It's alleged the SBU was involved in that, or Ukrainian intelligence was involved in that, especially in light of his comments on Ukraine. So what we have is possibly, I don't want to speculate too much, is Budanov is taking what might be the nuclear option when it comes to ensuring support for the war Ukraine continues, even if they are states as minor as Slovakia. And I know that Hungary, because of Orban's presidents, does punch above its weight, and especially now that it does have EU Council presidency, does carry a bit more clout. But even Hungary is a small nation, all things considered, and we likely have an attempt on Orban's life because of the war in Ukraine. But to continue on with his disputes with the European Union, Orban's disputes with the European Union, you do have Jessica Roswell, the Swedish Minister for EU Affairs, saying, quote unquote, Hungary's actions are damaging to the Union and should have consequences for Budapest. That is why Sweden will not participate in any political level in the informal government meetings scheduled for July. Of course, those are the ones that the EU Council, his own EU Council, which Hungary is supposed to be head of it at the moment, is subverting it. Of course, you have van der Leyen, who was recently re-elected to a position or reappointed to a position until 2029, really pushing through a lot of this. The EU Parliament has approved her continuation of her term. And with the European Parliament, Orban was actually not invited to the first plenary session of the EU Parliament, despite Hungary holding the EU presidency. And you have, so far on record, 63 members of European Parliament who want to strip Hungary of their voting rights. And in light of this, there were some interesting statements on Fico for one of his first addresses since his assassination attempt. So, some of the points he made with this was, on July 1st, he made his first public appearance, which infuriated the liberal opposition in their media. Fico's words, not mine. I would like to remind you that we are gradually putting Slovakia back on the right track. We want people to say at the end of the government's term that they are better off. The West is preaching only the right option about the war in Ukraine. They support the war to the last Ukrainian soldier. They will cheerfully applaud the winner of the women's swimming race, who until a few months ago was a red-blooded 100-kilogram man. So Fico engaging in a little bit of culture war issues, which is always entertaining. If you support them, then you can do anything. No one will know what you're doing in your country. Whether you are looting, destroying the opposition, or grossly violating human rights, you'll be allowed to do whatever you want. I could hardly believe what they did to Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He was scorned because, as a sovereign politician, he decided to visit Ukraine, Russia, and China and make peace initiatives. Instead, if he tried to convince the Slavs to kill each other even more vigorously, perhaps they would nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. In spirit of our sovereign position, we are prepared for the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. Like I said, these remarks are from earlier in the month, but I did want to address them, which was attended by Slovakia's defense minister and foreign minister. When agreeing on the text of the final declaration, I insist Ukraine's membership in NATO made only possible if all NATO members agree to it. I will publicly state Slovakia will not agree to Ukraine's membership in NATO. I understand Ukraine's wishes as a sovereign country, but Ukraine's membership in NATO means guaranteeing World War III. Although, frankly, even without Ukraine's NATO membership, we're not too far off from it. So those are the words of Robert Fico, Slovakian Prime Minister. I know with the demographics between those nations, sometimes it might be hard to tell. I didn't say that, but it's the reality of the situation. But otherwise, when it comes to news in Europe, like I said, the disputes about the government in Paris still continue. There does seem to be some headway that one of the members of the left-wing coalition are willing to coalesce with Macron. So we'll see how that develops and what comes of that. In the UK, you actually did have them send migrant boats back to continental Europe, which was unheard of under the Conservative government. Of course, Starmer, as I had addressed earlier, is full-throated pledged to Ukraine and also pledged to continue on with more or less any policies that Brussels shoves on it, de facto reintegrating itself into the European Union. It also seems rather determined on restoring stable governance. I know there were some talks from one of his cabinet ministers about cracking down on criminal gangs, and I'm sure we all know the ones that have been plaguing the UK for quite some time. And it does look like that some of these speculations that they're trying to bring back in the sensible left in order to shore up the discontent in society. That does seem to be the case. Now, of course, they will continue on doing things that are not advantageous to really any of the normal everyday people, but they're trying to make it less obvious. They're trying to make it more bearable because the situation had gotten out of hand, especially economically speaking, socially speaking, where they did have to bring in somebody who is willing to, like I said, shore up that support and pacify the population. So they will make overtures, they will make concessions, but at the end of the day, it's going to be still business as usual, and they're just turning the clock back a little because they have to. Their hands have been forced in that position. But I don't have too much other major European news beyond the. I know I discussed last week, but the cooperation between the U.S. and Germany with the basing of long-range missiles in Germany by the U.S. and the intention of developing a joint program for long-range missiles. We do have that as well. And there's speculation that the Russians will respond in kind by moving their missile positions further westward. I suppose at that point, Kaliningrad is the only other option that they would have, which would be a major escalation with that. But we'll see what the real tit-for-tat game with that is. But to continue on, I suppose, before we get into the big chunk of U.S. news here, I have some brief Middle Eastern updates. So probably the biggest two pieces of news out of the Middle East is out of Israel at least, there's bigger news out of the Middle East when it comes to Turkey and Syria, which I would say is probably dominating the headlines there. So there were rocket attacks from Hezbollah against IDF positions in northern Israel. Those do continue. The volleys of fire continue between both sides. But more pertinently, there was a drone attack in Tel Aviv near the U.S. Embassy that Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, have claimed credit for. And there's been some speculation that there was a joint cooperation effort between the two in order to launch the strike. I know that they had a joint effort because they are still separate entities, and the Yemeni civil war is still technically going on. But they have formed a united front in face of recent events involving Israel, and that they did conduct 3 operations targeting vessels in the Red Sea just earlier this week. But it is speculated that it was a joint operation. Some report that it was just the Yemeni government. Some report that it was the Houthis who conducted this attack near the U.S. Embassy, this drone attack in Tel Aviv. So that does continue. And Netanyahu had to cancel his visit to the U.S. to address Congress, which Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, did say he would make sure anyone disrupting the speech in Congress would be arrested, of course, because we all need to stand up and give our full-throated support to Netanyahu, give him nothing less than a standing ovation. The first person to stop clapping gets arrested. Very Stalinist in my opinion, but those were Mike Johnson's words, not mine. And perhaps I'm exaggerating even. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm doing it on purpose. Maybe I am hamming the story up because, you know what, I'm sure it's believable to some people that the lack of enthusiasm is an indictment in and of itself. But Netanyahu, who is beleaguered by his own internal political situation on top of the current war, cannot find time to go beg in front of Congress for more arms and more money, where he would face no opposition. And we'll see what really comes of Netanyahu's political career, what comes of the U.S. presidential elections, if the rift between Trump and Netanyahu has been mended. Because despite public appearances, there always was a very tense relationship between the two. And I think a lot of that could be attributed just to clash in personalities, just given the kind of people both of them are. But I digress on that. Getting on to more important Middle Eastern news, at least in my opinion. Oh, but I will add first, before I forget, that since the October 7th attacks, upwards of 40,000 businesses have left Israel because they do find it unviable to do business in that sort of climate. And that's not part of any sort of BDS or boycott effort. That's just pragmatism taking place, that it's more trouble than it's worth to maintain business operations in Israel. So over 40,000 have left Israel since October 7th. And of course they did launch strikes on Damascus actually the same day of the attempt on Trump's life. But going back to, like I said, more substantial news about the Middle East, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad put out a statement regarding relations with Turkey. Turkey is a neighboring country and our relations must be normal with it. But first, removing the causes of disagreements will restore normal relations with Turkey. We have some requirements that need to be met before the return of relations with Turkey. And a lot of those, of course, do have to deal with the withdrawal of Turkish forces from Syrian territory. The Turkish foreign minister likewise put out a statement. We agreed with our Saudi brothers to play a role in the normalization of relations with the Syrian government. We also expect the same role from Iran and Russia. So the detente efforts between Syria and Turkey do continue. That's the mending of a major bridge in all of this. Turkey was once one of the most fervent supporters of the Syrian opposition, as I've said many times. Turkey is the only other NATO country except the US with any significant occupation force in Syria. And they are turning their back on that. You'll recall in 2019, the alleged withdrawal deal for the US was giving more of a hand to Turkey in order to get American forces out of there. And that is when a lot of their operations that are still somewhat ongoing did start against the Kurdish forces. And as I had said earlier, Trump and Erdogan did have a phone call. So we'll see what the substance of that was, assuming Trump takes office, which I think is pretty likely at this point. I'll get into that, like I said, a little bit later in the show here. But it's more or less the end of the Syrian war, because at that point, is the U.S. going to fully dedicate its resources to the SDF in the last pockets of the Syrian opposition in the southeast of the country? I don't, as much as I think it would like to, I don't think it has the resources to. I don't think that it's their priority in light of everything else. But we'll have to see what happens with that. But going on to probably what most of you were anticipating with this episode, the domestic U.S. news. So, after I had recorded last episode, Biden gave the embarrassing press conference where, of course, we got the famous lines such as Vice President Trump and listen to the man. And, like I said, that was about an hour after I had recorded last episode, which I was going to do an update on that, just as an aside. And then, the next day, on July 13th, while at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania, there was a shooter who opened fire on Trump. Now, I'm sure we've all seen the footage at this point. We've all heard everyone's pet theory at that point. And, I mean, Trump himself has addressed it with his speech at the RNC. He dedicated the first section of his speech to that, which I'll talk a little bit about Trump's appearance at the RNC in a minute here. I will just say, given all the circumstances around it, I don't want to go through and dissect it bit by bit, because there's plenty of people who've done that rather well for that matter, but have already done that. I'm just saying I severely doubt the official story. I think to a degree it was weaponized incompetence that Trump had a bottom-of-the-barrel security team, because I don't think they expected it to go this far, but they wouldn't have cared if anything happened to Trump. And I know that the tune has changed now that something like that happened, because it opened up a whole new, let's just say, can of worms when it comes to U.S. politics, and a very dangerous can of worms that could have very easily spilled over had events turned out just slightly differently. Had a few things just gone differently, it could have led to a much more intense climate, politically speaking. And like I said, I don't think anyone would have expected it to go on this far, but I do think they gave him a sloppy security team. And what else can you say beyond that? No matter what happened, this was the best optics Trump has had in years. Probably since the initial energy of his 2016 campaign. Even people who were less than enthusiastic with Trump up until, say, last week, it would have been last week at this point, have this renewed confidence in him, which I understand. It was a great showing from Trump, and especially followed up by his speech and his public appearances. It was a great showing by him, and I could see why, especially when it comes to people who want to seethe about it, especially on the left, would say, oh, it's all a fake, it's all staged, whatever. And while I wouldn't put it past really any presidential candidate in a vacuum to create some sort of controversy, to create some sort of major event to draw attention to themselves and make themselves look good, number one, just the way the details played out, especially when it came to what happened. And I'm sure, like I said, we've all seen the video. Just the tilt of the head saved his life. That's not something you easily fake. Number two, I don't think Trump's campaign team think what you will of them. And I'm not even, like I said, I'm not even that particularly anti-Trump, nor really pro-Trump at that point. I've grown very neutral towards the man. I think there's a lot of interesting things to discuss, but my personal view is, like I said, it's balanced out. Very neutral towards the man. I don't think it's within his campaign team's capability to stage an event like this, assuming it was that. On the question of the motives, I know that they were trying to float around. Well, clearly this had ties to Iranian intelligence, and we must act because of that. Inconvenient. Looks like that story fell off quick because nobody believed it. The idea of one of Trump's internal political rivals, I think we all know which one, wanting a situation like this. But given the public response, I don't think anyone expected anything like this. Like I said, I think they were just content on leaving Trump with the worst possible security team and letting what consequences follow through from that. But they didn't expect anyone to actually go through it. Perhaps this kid, which let's be honest, he was 20 years old. I'm not going to say he didn't know any better because he did, but somebody who is very easily impressionable, especially at that age, talked into doing this by whoever, whatever. I don't think anyone would expect it to have gone that far. And like I said, had this been something that was supposed to be a big op, I think it would have played out much differently, even more dramatically than it already did. They're good at these kind of things. They're good at faking these kind of things. We've seen them do this thing over and over, and frankly, I don't think at least purposefully they would have included civilian casualties if this was anyone's op. I know it's a cop out to go with the lone wolf. It's a cop out to say whatever. And like I said, I'm not even necessarily saying that, especially with how sketchy this Thomas Crooks character is. I mean, even the name. Your villain of the story is named Crooks. Come on. I mean, and I fully accept that yes, coincidences do exist. That there are things that are just that stupid that do exist. I mean, let's think about just a historical example, the Hitler-Himmler thing. Nobody would have believed that if it was a fictional story. So sometimes things are just that stupid. And I don't even want to focus on the name too much, but I just do think it's kind of a funny name, given that this is supposed to be like the bad guy. And I don't know, maybe he was just a fall guy, and there was somebody else behind this operation. And I'm willing to believe that, but I think what has happened as a result of these events is much more important than the event itself. And I do want somebody to get to the bottom of this. I am interested in seeing what actually happened with all of this, but I'm not going to sit here and basically speculate more than I already have on this. I'd rather get on to what came of it. So, skipping to night 3 of the Republican National Convention. I mean, the National Convention was everything you'd expect. It's a lot of the establishment conservative talking points. Look, we have people who check X, Y, and Z demographic boxes. Why don't you join the Republican Party? It's such a big tent for everyone except the core of our base. That's what these conventions always are. And I'm not trying to excuse that. I'm not even trying to necessarily really scrutinize it that hard. It's what's to be expected. So, as I said earlier, it was announced on Monday that Ohio Senator JD Vance, very new political career, and of course, very controversial political career at that, was announced as Donald Trump's running mate. And of course, it surfaced as it had when he was running for the Senate, vehemently anti-Trump early on in 2016. Didn't really start to change his tune until well into Trump's first term, which that's how these things work. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm not even saying that to run defense for him because I have very mixed feelings about him as a candidate as a whole. But the idea that a snake worked his way into Trump's cabinet, there's been people who said far worse about Trump. There's been people who were anti-Trump for far longer that ended up in his first cabinet. And perhaps you could chalk that up to a judgment error by Trump. Perhaps you could chalk it up just to a lack of options by Trump that he ends up with these kind of people. But Vance got up there. He gave the speech that you'd expect, the populist speech, really appealing to that, talking about his working class background, how he worked his way up through the system, and now he, his rags to riches story, which I'll admit, out of any political figure, I do find him actually a compelling character in that regard. And sure, you could talk about how fabricated the story is. You can talk about how picture perfect it is, but I mean, there are people out there who do that kind of thing, and I do think he's a very interesting figure from that perspective. Odd connections, though. A lot of people bring up his connections to Peter Thiel, to Palantir, which is the artificial intelligence company that is being used by Israeli forces when it comes to the war in Gaza. And like I said, there's just a number of things with that do raise eyebrows. Ultimately, I do think there are far worse options out there insofar as electoral politics is concerned, and I've made it clear here, I don't think that the outcome of the election is going to change too much just because of external factors and things that are weighing down upon America both internally and externally. I think a lot of what's going to happen, it has, I don't want to say already has been determined, but it's going down a very certain course that I don't think it can be altered significantly by any individual political actors. But Vance, like a lot of things in this election cycle, really failed to drive me one way or another when it comes to feeling positively or negatively about it. And I'm not trying to present this image of, oh, I'm checked out, I'm above it all, and I can, stand up here at 30,000 feet and look at it all objectively. No, I certainly do have my opinions. But I will say, I'm just not moved too much either way when it comes to a lot of what's been happening with Trump. And I do want to talk about Trump's speech because I do think, objectively speaking, it was very good. And that given the circumstances, him and his team, I should say, I shouldn't give credit solely to him because I'm sure there were a lot of people who went into it. Him and his team played the situation masterfully. And one thing I will say before I get into the deep election talk here is that I can understand and sympathize with pretty much all the positions being put forth in this election by people on our side. I understand the people who want to get Trump back in the action, think he can redeem himself from his first time, pick up, he learned from his mistakes, so on and so forth. Like I said, I can understand that. In fact, I want to believe that. I can understand the people who are fed up with him and want nothing to do with him and say, I'm just sitting this one out. I can understand the same people to a certain degree, theoretically speaking, who throw their weight behind somebody like an RFK Jr., the protest candidate, even though I think RFK Jr. has discredited himself with a lot of stupid positions he's taken, especially when it comes to a lot of the Israel and foreign policy stuff. And of course, I think anyone who is still behind Biden at this point is either fully dedicated to the Democratic Party line or, which that's even a question at this point, given some of the internal party politics, or otherwise is just not being honest about the situation, is just some personally loyal to him or a Democratic partisan. So, but pretty much all of the right-wing views, like I said, I don't begrudge anyone for holding any of those, and I still haven't made up my mind whether I'm going to vote or not. I'm in a state that's sure to go red anyway, so it doesn't make that much of a difference in that regard. Trump is up I think 5 points in my state, so I wouldn't make that much of a personal difference. Not that I think electoral politics is that monumental of a thing. I think we've all been disillusioned to it to a certain degree within the past few years here. But it is interesting to watch it play out when it comes to power politics, what goes on when it comes to the people who really make the decisions, and what direction they're tilting towards. To get into Trump's speech, like I said, it was love him or hate him, he played it off well. And I know being a politician necessitates you having at least decent acting skills. But I do think when Trump recounted the story of what happened to him last week, there was some genuine element to it. Like I said, I'm sure that there was a lot of focus grouping that went into this. I'm sure there was a lot of political consideration that went into this, but whether it was he who was directly involved with it or his speechwriters or whoever, they did well. I think the most important thing it did, beyond any of the policy talk that he gave, which a lot of the policy talk he gave was just stuff that you'd expect. And that was second half of the speech, so to speak. But it was the America first. We're gonna be strong, and we're gonna negotiate peace agreements. We're gonna get the economy back online, and blah blah blah. All the stuff that you come to expect from Trump. He did make a point of taking the high road because apparently his previous speech was thrown out. They wrote up this one in light of what happened to him, that he wanted to present himself as a unity candidate. He didn't want to be bashing Biden the entire time, which allegedly his first draft of the speech leaned towards that. Which, like I said, I think he played it off well, coming off as the unity guy, especially in light of Biden's interview and Biden's statements after the assassination attempt. His calls for unity immediately followed by going off about Trump being a threat to democracy in a very incoherent manner, as one expects with Joe Biden. But Trump did pull off what he wanted to do well. He hit on all the key policy issues that he has campaigned on. Now, whether he's lived up to over the past 8 or so years is certainly a different question. But like I said, rhetorically it was very good, and it accomplished what it needed to. But I think first and foremost, the most important thing it did is it took the larger-than-life character, the people who, whether they are for or against him or anywhere in between, have viewed him as the reality TV star, the guy who dramatizes everything, the guy who, like I said, is larger than life and really plays into the character that has been built around him. He spoke to the people in a much different way than you would have expected him to, which I think greatly played to his advantage and has greatly won over the sympathy of people who were undecided or even tilted against him. So, like I said, there's not much you could say policy-wise because it's the same things he's been saying for the last 8 years. And while I hope he can accomplish most of them, of course, there's some of them that I'm vehemently against. I have my misgivings, certainly. And I'll clarify once again, I'm not trying to be contrarian. I'm not being pessimistic for just the sake of it. But I do have to admit that is honestly where I stand, and I don't begrudge you if you have a much more positive assessment of Trump. And in fact, I hope to share in your optimism one day, and I hope he does live up to your expectations because something needs to be done. America is in a dire state, both domestically and abroad. There's no denying that. But like I said, I think simply because of how the situation has played out, both domestically and abroad, there's just a lot of inevitabilities. There's a lot of things that, even if we were to assume the best about Trump, give him the best team in the world, and everything, like I said, the ideal Trump, the one we would all like to imagine he is, he's still up against, I would say, a situation that, in many cases, cannot be turned in his favor just by one administration, and that these problems are deeply entrenched, and there is a lot that would need to be done in order to change them on many different levels. But I digress with that. Ultimately, I think Trump is cruising to victory. Regardless of what one's personal opinion might be, they pulled it off well. And he's gained the sympathy of many people, including a number of people in the establishment. I know Mark Zuckerberg, who was, of course, huge Hillary Clinton supporter back in 2016, partook in the censorship of Trump and right-wing opinions, was out there in the media giving him credit, calling him a badass for being able to recover the way he did and give up there and give that speech. Tacit endorsements. One explicit endorsement, Elon Musk saying he's going to give $45 million a month to Trump until the end of the campaign through a super PAC. So there is, of course, the alt-elite, I guess you could call them, people like Musk, who are by all means elite, but are on the fringes of it, who have gathered behind Trump. Peter Thiel would be another one. And, of course, Bill Ackman of Harvard, infamy, given the recent protests and the debacles that took place in the college campuses earlier this year, has thrown his weight behind Trump. And, like I said, even now you have people who are in the media giving more sympathetic voices. Well, on the other hand, we can look at Joe Biden, and pretty much it's the exact opposite when it comes to that. So, I already covered the incoherent press conference he gave last week, actually right after I finished recording the show, where we got the infamous Vice President Trump sound bit and the Listen to the Man sound bit, followed up by his address to the nation the day after the incident with Trump, where he talked about cooling down political rhetoric and solving issues at the battle box. Clearly he meant ballot box, but he said battlefield before. It was also at 8 p.m. It was past his operating hours, which are 10 to 4. I'm sure you've all heard it at this point. And he mumbled and bumbled his way through that speech. And then he gives an interview on, I believe it was Monday. It was either Monday or Tuesday, with Lester Holt for NBC. It was on Monday because it was at the start of the start of the Republican convention, where he's like, "Oh yes, things need to be cooled down. I talked to Trump, and it was amicable, blah blah blah, and we wished each other. I wished him well in light of that, and yes, all of that." And then he immediately tears into, well, Trump is a threat to democracy. He's a liar. He lied about the election being stolen, returning back to the rhetoric that one would think he denounced. And I do think that at a certain point that is because Joe Biden's mental state is so degraded at this point. He just forgot that there's supposed to be a narrative shift, because I'm no doctor. I'm not qualified to diagnose him. But public consensus, I will say, public consensus seems to shift to the idea that Biden has dementia. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, like I said, just to avoid any sort of major scrutiny, or I don't know, and just cover all our bases here. I'm not saying that officially, but clearly Biden is experiencing some sort of cognitive issues. We can say that at the bare minimum. And I do think because of those cognitive issues, he can't keep the story straight. He can't partake in political narratives the same way he did. And that's why he reverts back to the inflamed rhetoric that he was supposed to be denouncing, which makes him look all the more embarrassing. And even when it comes to the internal machinations against Biden, whether that be from the media, whether that be from the Democratic Party itself, you had Lester Holt, once again, these mainstream media figures who usually softball Biden, understandably so, because that's the arrangement they have with him. Even he was pushing back. He's like, well, Mr. President, don't you think you're partaking in that rhetoric? And like I said, we're talking about somebody who's like years-long NBC news reporter. So it's clearly not, this isn't like somebody from like some online right-wing magazine drilling into Biden. This is mainstream media here. And it was a very short interview because they really didn't cover much ground with that. And now you have Barack Obama coming out making his public statements, saying that he's trying to advise Joe on the path going forward. Allegedly, that means in the background he is pressuring Joe to bow out of the elections. Chuck Schumer also is in a similar state. The New York Times did report that Democratic voters demanded Biden not run for president, and that they froze 90 million in campaign funds and demanded the U.S. president withdraw from the election race. And it also noted that another consequence of Biden's failure in the debate with Trump, and that the funds were frozen or intended to sponsor the election campaign, and they will be unfrozen after the current president, at the words of the article, not mine, officially refuses to participate in the elections. You have Kamala, of course, if you're to believe some of the internal news coming out of this, is also pressuring Joe to step down, pressuring Joe Biden to step down and bow out of the race. And interesting thing that came up was an interview from late 2020 after Biden secured the election, of course, the freest, fairest, and most popular election of our lifetime in 2020. And he said he made an agreement with Kamala Harris that if he were to fall ill during his term, he would resign. He would not hesitate to resign. So that resurfaces. Biden has been diagnosed with COVID, so they tell us. While on his way to a campaign rally, while he's not wearing the mask, remember they wanted to champion the mask as the vital thing against COVID. And that conveniently comes out at a time when all the pressure around him, whether that be from the Obama wing of the party, whether that be from Chuck Schumer, whether that be from even Adam Schiff, who was really the attack dog of the Democrats when it came to a lot of the stuff in the Trump administration, he was always up there running his mouth about that. Adam Schiff calling on Biden to step down. Or step aside in the race. Nobody's calling for his resignation, but they are calling for him to drop out of the race. And the virtual vote to confirm him as the nominee before they went into the DNC was postponed from July 20th, which would be the day this is airing. I believe that's when it was supposed to be, to August 7th. And then the convention itself takes place on August 19th. So they wanted to go into the convention with Biden having secured the nomination so he can get up there and give a speech on the final night and be completely coherent, as I'm sure he would be, and go into the election business as usual. But now there's calls from some in the party and some donors to go into an open convention and nominate a new candidate there. And since the debate, this has been discussed heavily. What are the options here? How are they going to get him to step down from the race? What are they going to do to supplement the candidate? Would Kamala do it? How would they secure the campaign funds? How would they get him on the ballot? Realistically, the only way this happens is, at least the way I see it, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I'm missing something, is that Biden steps down from office, he resigns from office, lets Kamala continue, because if the president is to leave office for any reason, whether that be as a result of him passing or him resigning or whatever, impeachment, etc., the vice president assumes all of that. In an election year, the vice president assumes top of the ticket. And it's also reported, like I said, I don't want to go too deep into this, that Kamala is exploring vice presidential candidate options, as if she is going to be the one on the top of the ballot. Which I think is not out of the realm of possibility. I don't think it's likely. I don't want to put a certain chance on it, but it's going to be a hard fight at the convention, but I think they've painted themselves into a corner when it comes to Biden. That they have to stick by their bad decision, that going with Biden is a certain defeat, even with all the fortification they can do, that they will lose if they run Biden. But if they project the image of weakness by swapping him out at the convention or swapping him out at some point before the convention, it's going to be sharks with blood in the water. The Republicans are going to pounce on that, and they're going to secure greater margins in the elections than they thought previously. And that they're going to destroy the confidence of their own voter base, even more so than it already is, by sticking with their bad decision instead of going back on it. Because, like I said, it does not inspire confidence in the party if they go back on it. We've heard since 2019 that Joe Biden's cognitive abilities are completely fine, that he won't struggle going into office, and the longer he's in office, the more his mental state declines. And at a certain point, if they do get him to withdraw his candidacy, or even resign at that point if they wanted to go all the way with it, it's an admission of defeat on their part. Now, I know that they're impeccable at shifting narratives, that they can change them in real time. But when it comes to the undecided voter, when it comes to the people that they could possibly peel off who aren't satisfied with Trump, realistically, they have to stick with Biden. If they want to, I would say, preserve any sort of integrity. Oh, no, integrity is not the right word. But if they want to preserve any sort of projection of integrity they have as a party, just stick with it, roll with the punches, take the L in the 2024 election, and then position yourself against Trump in 2028. Because, and what I think a lot of the pro-Trump rhetoric does lend itself towards, unfortunately, is that they are gearing him up to accept the blame for a lot of the issues at hand, whether that be economic issues, whether that be immigration or foreign policy issues such as Israel and Ukraine, where when those things go wrong because of just everything that has happened, even before Trump and Biden, even going back into the Obama years, just the long-term consequences coming to a head of that, having Trump as the front man, having Trump as the guy who that all comes who has to deal with the consequences of those actions, who has to deal with the consequences of the past 15, 20 years of policy. That's a great look for him. Look, you wanted Trump back, you got him back. You could have stayed with Brandon. He would have been perfect. He would have been the most coherent and popular president in American history. But no, you just had to have Trump back, so vote for Gavin Newsom or whatever clown we're going to put up in 2020. And I do think that if the Democrats have any sort of strategy, they'll do that. They'll throw this election. They'll let Trump bear the consequences. I don't know, unless they fear that he can actually improve the situation, in which case I think they have a far more optimistic assessment of the situation than a lot of people, even on the right wing. But assuming that these problems are going to come to... I mean, hell, that's what they should have done in 2020. Concede the election, understand that things are going to get bad. Now, for full clarity, I think Biden did make a lot of things exponentially worse, but when it came to a lot of the economic issues, when it came to the wars abroad, whether that's the Middle East, Ukraine, tensions with China and Taiwan, a lot of that stuff was going to come to a head in the early 2020s, just as an inevitability. And had they had Trump in office, had they had him in the second term, they could say, this is Trump's America, this is everything Trump had brought. Look at the Obama era, aren't you so nostalgic for it? Why don't you vote for... and I don't know, whatever low-level Obama admin official that they dug up to run this year. Realistically, that would have been the smart things for the Democrats to do. Just concede the ground on Trump. Unless, like I said, they believe that he would actually affect policy in such a way that would be so disadvantageous for them that they needed to act quickly. And perhaps that was a debate in the party. But realistically, if I were to advise the Democrats, which I don't want to do, but just speaking objectively as an observer in all of this, like I said, they just need to throw this election. They just need to let Biden lose, let him mumble, bumble, and incoherently stumble his way out of office. Lay the blame on all the consequences, everything that's going to come to a head in the next 4 years, on Trump. And then you have normal-looking white dude Gavin Newsom. What? I'm telling you, the country's starving for a normal-looking white dude. He would win in a landslide. Pick up the pieces and say, "Oh, this is how we're doing it now. Look at you just had to, you just had to pick Trump again." And I don't want to. That's not a certainty. Of course, there's a lot of things that could happen in the next 4 years. Very unknown, but I think, regardless of where you stand, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, whatever, right, even right or left, a lot of people understand that this is going to be a very tumultuous next 4 years. The rest of the decade is going to be a very choppy waters. And at that rate, I think the color revolution against Biden, and it is a color revolution, so far, 2 election cycles in a row. We had one against Trump, especially with a lot of the BLM stuff. And now we're having one against Biden with his own party and the media seeming to want to throw him under the bus. Where all the color revolutions that we had spent years fomenting across the world, we proved we could do at home once. And now that the situation is less than favorable to the regime, I suppose we can call them, they want to do it again. Even if they have to, try to co-opt Trump, or if they already have, or whatever. Or if they want to force out Biden and find some suitable replacement. If they want to use the Gavin Newsom card this early. And I'm just using him as a fill-in for generic Democrat who has public appeal. I don't know, maybe I overstate his public appeal. Maybe I overstate how much he could win over the undecided voter. But I think he's a reasonable candidate. Love him or hate him, I think he's a reasonable candidate for something like that. Or, I don't know, maybe they're delusional enough to believe that Kamala Harris actually can win. Because her poll numbers are... once again, take that for what you will when it comes to the polls. Her poll numbers are technically better against Trump in a few key states. I think Virginia is one of them, and... because Virginia is contested right now. And also Arizona. Don't quote me on that, but I think that was the other one that they were talking about being closer margins. Or they should say that, of course, Virginia is tilting blue in both scenarios. There are some cases where, like I said, it's a much tighter margin. Some of the more contested western states, think Nevada and Arizona, which are both going to be vital for this election cycle. But ultimately, I don't think either of them can rally the support against Trump. And even when it comes to election fortification, I think that they overplayed their hand on that. And while they certainly do have the mechanisms to do that, they need to be a bit more prudent with, let's just say, all the options at their disposal. And as it stands now, the two potential candidates they could put up, if they stick with Biden or they stank on him for Kamala, neither one can really put up that effective resistance needed to stop Trump. In which case, like I said, perhaps they'll try to make peace with him, perhaps they already are making peace with him, or perhaps they have some wild card at the DNC. In fact, one thing that's been the favorite of a lot of like BoomerCon conspiracy theories that I have to admit I don't believe, but I quite enjoy, so I'll bring it up anyway. The polling numbers for a potential matchup between Trump and Michelle Obama, Michelle Obama actually fares the best out of her, Kamala Harris, and Biden, which I think is hilarious. Now, how would those actually translate to election results, we would have to see. But the DNC, like I said, is a month out. We'll see what sort of nonsense they can pull there. And I'll be honest, I'm looking forward to what what a disorganized nightmare the Democratic National Convention is going to be. And it seems like we're all in for a fun time. But I suppose with that, I've covered everything I've had for this episode at least. And I will see you guys next time we do an episode that we should have plenty more to cover by then, plenty more details to cover even on some of the stories I'd already gotten into. And I'll see you guys then, and goodbye.